and welcome to the How To Academy. I am Robert Ince, and I'm joined by someone who is genuinely one of my favourite people to talk to, and I always leave with a sky that was wider than it was before after listening to him. Is Alan Moore, and we are going to be talking predominantly about The Great When, which is the first part of his Long London trilogy. But before we get on to that, I just have to quickly mention today is the day that the Bumper Book of Magic also makes the shops, isn't it, Alan?
It apparently is. I don't really keep up with these things as much as I should do, but yes, I am reliably informed that Thursday is the day when the bumper book comes out, and it does look gorgeous. It's probably a lot of adult nonsense, but sort of it's very beautifully presented.
It's not nonsense, almost disappointingly, because I remember you sending me a chapter. I mean, like, this must have been about 10 years ago, because obviously it's had a very, a strange gestation. And I remember checking with Brian Cox because he knows stuff,
Yeah,
and he was fine about it. So,
really.
mm,
Well, I'm surprised. I was trying to make it as rational as I can pretend to be. I've used a lot of rational words in it, even if some of the actual concepts that they're describing may be a bit borderline. But no, I think that it's fairly sensible, and I think it's probably the first magical grimoire that has actually been very, very lovely and a bit of a laugh,
yeah,
and it's got a political position. I mean, if magic's anything, it should have a political position, and all too often in the past, that position has been very far right, sort of. Yeah, this is kind of psychedelic, funny, beautiful magic the way that I see it, you know.
well, because you brought up politics, I suppose I would almost like to start about thinking, reading the latest book, and then thinking back over Lost Girls and Jerusalem and From Hell. It doesn't seem to get mentioned as much as I think it should. That to me, you are a very political writer in terms of looking, in particular, I think the element of class as well, and that seems to really come across, I think, in The Great When.
Well, yeah, that was one of the most important things for me because I was thinking if I'm going to do a series of fantasy books, I wasn't entirely comfortable with that for a long time because it seems that just about everybody does a series of fantasy books. So um, I figured that if I was going to do a series of fantasy books, there were certain things that I wanted to make sure were in there. And one of them was the class perspective. That all too often you could get the impression that it's only middle class children who are allowed through the wardrobe into Narnia, whereas I don't. That's not entirely true. There are people like Alan Garner
Mm.
who seems to have a more working class perspective in his work, but generally, um, if it's not a middle class child to begin with, it will appear to be a working class child, but it will later be revealed that in fact they've got aristocratic parentage somewhere in the background, So, no, this was going to be all from a kind of low life perspective, mainly because most of the characters that I was interested in are kind of in that category.
Mm.
They're kind of marginalized figures at the bottom of society. Um, so that was a really big thing, insisting on that. And also, um, I've been recently sort of talking to people about, different possibilities for the Great One. And sort of one of the things that I also insisted on was that the fantasy should be a shock. Because when these kids go through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia, it's no big deal. Whereas just at the first glimpse of Mr. Tumnus or whatever, that they'd be in therapy for the rest of their lives. They would be sort of vomiting. They would be in shock. I mean, whenever a character goes in or out of the Great Wen, they are generally vomiting, weeping, fainting, sort of shivering, because I wanted to. Fantasy would be a shock. I don't like the coziness that fantasy has kind of wrapped itself in. This kind of blanket of warm, reassuring tropes. So I wanted to make up a lot of stuff that was, yeah, just seemed interesting to me, like the Popes of Blades or the Beauty of Riots or things that weren't drawn from anywhere else, but were perhaps genuinely a bit startling because any kind of fantastic experience would be a bit startling, you know. But yeah, the class element was a big thing, and yeah, you're right. I suppose ever since I started doing more work, I've always attempted to try and get some sort of political or moral dimension into it, because otherwise it'd just kind of be entertainment,
Mm,
and you need to have something else, as you would know. You know, sort of that's why you don't go onto the stage and tell jokes.
mm.
There's got to be more to it, you know.
But that's what I think I notice it even more in your work now because there seems to be just less of it in so many other, just in the world. I think about when I was growing up, and on television every night there would be a documentary that would give you a look into lives that were not like your own.
Mhm.
And so I think, the in some ways the importance of the way that you're dealing with those narratives, and also what you did with Jerusalem as well. It seems to keep. I don't know if it's in any. I don't know if it's you changing, or it's just that because so many things now have kind of been pasteurized, that this now seems so much richer. Those possibilities.
Well, I think it might be a bit of both, but I probably am intensifying that stuff as I get older and I come to feel that it's more and more important. But at the same time, I do think that a lot of culture, it seems a bit pasteurized. It seems as if it's been put through a bit of a blender, and I don't really get the sense of shock and excitement that I have got from culture in the past.
Mm,
You know, I don't really see that around anymore, which makes it all the more important, I suppose, to try and differentiate yourself from that. To try and do something that nobody could mistake a large language model AI. You
mm.
know, it's sort of yeah. I don't think there's going to be any AI versions of my work anytime soon. You know, but as these things loom, it's probably wise for us humans to sort of up our game a little bit. You know.
See, that's an interesting because that's one of the things that I felt in terms of art and AI. And of course, again, this is that capitalism thing. We don't need the artist for this. We can save money. We just got, but that does seem to be part of the challenge that you're rising to, which is in the same way when photography arrives, and then those who paint go, well, hang on a minute. People don't just want me to paint that valley because they can take a photograph of that valley or get someone. So what can I now do? So do you have that challenge in the back of your mind as well as going, right, well, what do I keep doing to make sure, you don't live that far from Bletchley Park and where so many of these things were kind of first being, discussed. And that bit of going, we must always somehow make sure we're better, to be smarter than your smartphone, as Chuck D would say.
Yeah, I think that's probably, yeah, that is part of the challenge. That as culture becomes more all permeating and sort of it seeps into everywhere, and at the same time it becomes, to my mind, its values seem to be dropping at the same time as it becomes more expansive and reaching into more and more areas of life. So yes, it is important to actually show what the prose medium can do. It's like any medium that I'm going to be involved in. I mean, when I started out in comics, uh, it was completely ignored culturally as a medium, and then I kind of screwed all that up, and now it's what it is now, which I'm not necessarily very pleased with, but sort of. But it was a matter of simply doing better comics
Mhm.
to exploit the things that comics can do that no other medium can do. Um, and that's the same way that I tend to approach prose fiction, to try and think of the things that can be done in a novel that can't be done in a movie, in a comic book. And I mean, a lot of that is just the magic of words themselves, because I still think that that is the highest form of technology,
Mhm.
language, because it's the technology that all of the other technologies are predicated upon. That's why they've got that logi bit in them, writing's about technique.
Mhm.
You've got to have writing first, and sort of, and it's such an elegant technology because it's just 26 letters and a smattering of punctuation. And with that, you can create any conceivable universe just with rearrangements of those letters. I mean, that is awesome. Um, I don't think that has been bettered. And that, if you're doing it properly, it should be virtual reality.
Mhm.
Because, yes, I mean, there's some marvelous and compelling things that can be done with virtual reality. But I suggest that sort of, yeah, I could put you in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, sort of, so that you could actually feel the recoil of the cannons. You could maybe even smell the powder in the air, all of that, the screams of the horses. If you could imagine a virtual reality that you could do all of that, that would still be inferior to reading War and Peace. Um, so to my mind, uh, yeah, prose fiction is probably as near as it gets to perfect virtual reality. The way that you, if it's a good book, you can just completely lose yourself in it. You're in that world for as long as you're reading it. You're hearing things, you're smelling things, you're creating images in your mind. It's a virtual experience, and I think that too many people perhaps get overawed by the spectacle of what our modern technologies can accomplish, and forget how powerful some of our older and oldest technologies are. So
Well, I'm sorry.
yeah, no, no, I'll finish, mate.
No, I was just going to say that it's one of the things that I love about your phrasing is, I think it's beautiful if we were all in the same room, all reading a book, we would be playing different films in our head. We would be making something different. But some books are quite instructional in the image that they want you to have. But whereas when you use a phrase like the calling a delinquent lawn, there's a delinquent lawn very early in the book. And a delinquent lawn, I think, gives us a huge arena. There's in terms of the number of delinquent lawns in people's minds, the way that you put and the millipede. Is it the millipedal? I'm trying to remember. There's beautiful talk about the movement within the shoes of someone. And it's millipedal, and
Yeah.
millipedal again. That gives you so many different options of imagination in those situations.
Well, I've really, I mean, like, there's when I first read Ian Sinclair's stuff, or Brian Caplin's stuff, or Steve Aylett's stuff, that you can become overwhelmed by the sort of the neural bombardment of the way that these people use language. And that it makes you aware that you've kind of got to up your game a little bit. That's where the benchmark has been raised to, and using words to really use them to sort of to putting them in different orders. Um, that is apparently there's an actual proper posh name for that, which is hyperbaton. This was something that the Greeks realised that by putting words into slightly the wrong order, a bit like Yoda or somebody, then this is hyperbaton, and it's actually quite catchy. It sort of gets an effect, a rhetorical effect conversationally. So yeah, that's it. And using rare words, and I'm also really big on like the decadence.
Mm.
And there was one of them, it might have been Phil Gautier, or it might have been somebody else. You know how unreliable I am with facts. I may have dreamed this,
Yeah.
but but it was a guy who said he said that you shouldn't use the same word, I think, twice on a page, which is you can't, you have to use like definite and indefinite articles. You've got to repeat them, but sort of as a principle of trying not to repeat words. Um,
I think it was Nicholas
that is
that said that actually.
sorry, who was it?
Nicholas Parsons in the
Really?
setup of Radio 4's
Of
Just a
course, yes. And no deviation as well, or
Yeah.
sort of. But yeah, 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 yeah. I'm with it. But yeah. I mean, so I do tend to probably obsessively and probably to a fault. I do spend a lot of time thinking, is there another word that would be more unusual and would get a different neural response from the reader? Because that's ultimately what it is. You're trying to get the reader's neurons fizzing and excited. And I think that certain combinations of words can sort of just briefly excite or surprise people, which will add to their enjoyment. I remember hearing, unless I dreamed it again, but I remember hearing that when people have got um, their they're having sort of brain imaging scans while reading Shakespeare. I heard that sort of that apparently when Shakespeare he plays with language. And I don't think this phrase actually appears anywhere in Shakespeare, but it was the example I heard, which was "Wouldst thou lip a board?" where Shakespeare has taken a noun, lip, and changed it into a verb, which in context means like to kiss, and he's taken an adjective, bawdy, and made it into a noun, a board, which sounds like a sex worker, a bawdy woman, whatever. So, but Shakespeare does that. They found that when Shakespeare does something like that, the brain response starts to sort of light up all over as if it's kind of really excited. And they also found that Shakespeare would place these language tricks just before he had a big dramatic denouement, as if he was trying to, I mean, he couldn't have known this, but as if he was instinctively priming the audience's neurology
Mm.
for the big, dramatic sort of finale and end piece. So, yeah, that's the way that I try to use language, because if you use it right, and I use rhythm a lot as well. I obsess over getting the right rhythm to things, um, because the entire purpose is to put the reader into a trance,
Mhm.
where you control the horizontal and the vertical until they put the book down or whatever.
See,
That's
that's
the
what
ideal.
I wondered how much if you see a change in your writing as you increasingly learnt about ideas of magic. And I remember you saying something which seemed so incredibly obvious the moment you said it, which I'd never thought before, which was the idea that, a spell, a magical spell is literally spelling. We can curse someone by putting together a sentence which ruins their reputation or creates, all of that. And do you see the way that you write and that sense of putting people into a trance, has that become increasingly enhanced with the deeper understanding of, the history of magic and the psychology of magic?
That has been that has been vital. One of the reasons I got interested in magic and decided to involve myself in it was because I felt that I'd probably got to the limits of what I could achieve in my thinking and thus in my work by rationality alone. I felt that it might take a further step beyond the boundaries of rationality, which, however, however wonderful rationality is as a system, and it is wonderful, it is still a system. And for it to be a system, there must be a boundary on that system. There must be an outside to it. And so taking that step into allowing that some of these ideas might have validity and experimenting with them and trying them out. But I first came to understand that actually there's very little difference between magic and any form of artistic expression, but specifically with writing. That for some reason, most of the magic gods in our ancient cultures are also gods of writing. Thoth, Hermes, Odin. These are all, scribe gods or language gods. Um, and that's because, there's very little difference. They are both ways, magic and language, they alter consciousness. Pretty much our entire awareness of the world, after Count Korzybski, um, that he more or less says that, well, it's all language, it's all words. That's how we think, that's how we put together the world around us. It's all made of language. And in fact, this kind of consciousness is probably permitted by language. So language probably precedes consciousness.
Mm.
And so if you can actually use that language, then I think that this is what magic meant. I mean, one of the original magic powers that you might get along with changing into animals or flying was poetry. This was seen as a magical power because it is. It can
Mm.
do wonderful things. It affects the consciousness of a person. It sort of drums its rhymes into people's memories. It's a fantastic mnemonic tool. Um, all of these things are they're greatly enriched by an understanding of them, and like pretty much the way that what magic is for me now. I mean, when I was just starting out in it, sort of 25 years ago or whatever it was, uh, 30 years ago, when I was just starting out with uh, it was all about the spectacle and the excitement of, rituals and summoning things or imagining that you'd summoned things. But as I've got older with it, it's more something that I've incorporated in just my everyday life and in how I do everything and how I think about everything, and particularly how I think about my work. So yes, everything that I write, well, perhaps the odd shopping list I might be getting a bit sort of lax on, but sort of everything that I write seriously is informed by my ideas about magic and my ideas about what writing actually is and what it does.
Well, I was thinking about how you I think when we talked about Jerusalem a while ago, and the fact that when I then went back to Northampton for the first time, having finished it, the air does become thicker. It becomes thicker with, that, as I know, the block universe and Einstein, and thinking about those things, you do get that sense, however psychosomatic you wish to consider it, for whoever, you go, oh, there's more ghosts as I walk past the Black Lion pub now. And as I go under that underpass, there is the sense of everyone else. And now moving from Northampton, which I was actually, before I get to that, I want to. Do you feel that in some ways you sold us short by moving to London? Because, as in the book, because I remember you made a promise where each further novel would be a smaller part of Northampton, a longer novel, but over a smaller space. And the final one would now be in like pretty much a toilet somewhere on the third floor of an old, timbered house, and the whole
And it would
500,000 words would happen over that.
and it would all be about my armchair or something, yeah, by
Yeah.
that point. Yes, I did say that, but I found it, as with a lot of the things that I say, Robin, they don't really work out in practice. But, yeah, I suppose I think that with Jerusalem, I mean, I've probably not exhausted what there is to say about Northampton. I don't suppose that you ever could. But, I was thinking that probably for a series of fantasy novels, I shouldn't assume that Northampton is going to be as interesting to people as London. And also that I've worked with an awful lot of the material that is to hand in Northampton. There are some things that I haven't touched on yet, but probably not enough for a series of books. Whereas with London, Um, there was just an incredible array of characters and situations and things that I could ingeniously, even if I say so myself, I shouldn't, ingeniously, I could arrange all of the bizarre episodes in The Great When and the subsequent books to fit with existing historical reality and what was known about these people. Yeah, all right. I have to stretch my imagination to sort of link some things up, but that has probably been the biggest challenge. Actually, coming up with all of this psychedelic nonsense, and then having to fit it into the real history of London and the people who were around then.
Mm,
Um, but in the second book, I've got to tell you this. This is absolutely incredible. The second book, we're in 1959, and there's different characters involved. There's David Litvinov and Michael de Freitas, who became Michael X, and Peter Rackman, and Joe Meek, the record producer, who has been like the most fantastic character. Once I'd realised, okay, so he was a gay music business personality in London, 1959. But that would have had its difficulties, but so were a lot of music biz figures at that time. You know, people like Brian Epstein, people like that. But the difference was that people like Brian Epstein had got, they spoke in received English. They had suave, urbane delivery, and Joe came from Newent, on the edge of the Forest of Dean in Gloucester. And I thought, yeah, being gay with a Gloucester accent, that probably wouldn't have worked. Once I'd got Joe's voice and sort of, or at least my approximation of it, and his belligerent sort of probably pep pill saturated personality. He was very difficult a lot of the time with people, but I get the sense very lovable.
mm,
So yeah, I got all of these scenes involving Joe Meek, Um, and then I got this letter through the post a couple of Saturdays ago, um, from a lady who is actually living in Northampton. Um, and she introduced herself by saying that she was Elaine Duke, um, who was the widow of the late Robbie Duke. I mean, so far I didn't recognise any of these names. And then she said Robbie Duke, who had previously been known as Patrick Pink. At which point, I was slack-jawed because, as she went on to say, Patrick Pink was Joe Meek's studio assistant and the last person to see Joe alive.
Mhm.
Um, she and her husband had moved to Northampton some years ago. I think he passed away in 2018. She'd always felt that she'd just ended up in Northampton. Then she read Jerusalem and realised that it was actually the central pivotal point of the universe. Um, and then she'd just read The Great When, which has got a mention of Joe Meek in the kind of in the epilogue. And so, but apparently, she's got all of this information. I'm going to be doing something in the beginning of book three. There's going to be a section that would have been from Patrick Pink's perspective. So as soon as I get a let up from all of this work, I'm going to be meeting with this woman and find. And one of the best things that she said was that apparently in late 1966 and early 1967, at Joe Meek's Holloway Road studio, there was a part-time worker who was stacking tapes, things like that, uh, whose name was Dennis, surname unknown. Um, so, I mean, this is a gift, you know. So, yeah, it's things like that that make you feel that you're probably on the right track.
Mhm.
That that yeah, when things start happening in your life that are very much like what's happening in your fiction at the same time. Yeah, it feels like a confirmation that, yeah, you are making all of this stuff up, but it resonates properly.
Do you? I mean, I was thinking as I was reading the book and about there are certain people who seem to have so many potential stories in them. Like I was saying to you before we started doing this, I look at the shelf of the books that I've got of yours, and there's not really a quiet period. Certainly, as a member of the audience, of and I think of certain people like Harlan Ellison or Ursula Le Guin, and you look and you just go, look at all that. And do you see anything? Is there anything you can look towards and think, somehow this is what has made you the storyteller that you are? That there's no, it's not like you go, I've hit 70 now and I'm going to relax. It's like, I better speed up now because I've got this trilogy to do. And then there's going to be new ideas that are just going to keep on growing.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, I don't know. I mean, like, where I first became aware of what was possible with writing would probably have been Mervyn Peake,
Mm.
perhaps the Gorman Gas trilogy, which I think I read in the wrong order because that was just uh, that was just my thing back then. I was because I got most of my trilogies out of the library, and if they weren't available, you'd read book one, but book two wasn't available, but book three was. Then inevitably you'd read. So I read Titus Ground first. I read Titus Alone, which was an enormous disappointment as the second book, and then read the wonderful Gorman Gas as the third one, and then rearranged them in my head. In fact, recently I've watched, I think, three seasons of What We Do in the Shadows in the wrong order. Yeah, completely the wrong order. But yeah, this is just something that comes with age, I think. But
What's that? The B.S. Johnson? Is it? Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. B.S. Johnson. It is B.S. Johnson, isn't it? Who wrote that book, which is I hope I'm not the guy who wrote Christy Mulry's Double Entry. Um, Wrote the book which you chapter one and chapter and the last chapter have to be at the beginning and the end, but then you're allowed to just keep moving around all the chapters in between.
All of the stuff in between. Yeah, yeah. It's sort of I probably I probably wouldn't go that far, although I really appreciate that sort of that experimental spirit. But I do try to make all of the chapters. Well, this was probably more true in Voice of the Fire in Jerusalem, but in those books, each chapter was a self-contained piece in itself. They had got loads of connections running through them, but you could take each chapter and it was almost a self-contained short story in itself. Uh, with The Great When, I've kind of more embraced the fact that no, this is a novel. It's a series of chapters that relate to each other. They don't all have to be sort of with the same completeness that you were going for in Jerusalem or Voice of the Fire. But at the same time, you do try to make each unit of the book as perfect as you can. So each chapter, I want it to be as well rounded and well structured, and each paragraph and each sentence, as best you can, sort of trying to get them perfectly polished. This is why most of my works are pretty much a first draft.
Mm.
Um, and that always have been because when I was working for a serial medium like comics, where the next installment is next week, or if you're in America, next month, then by the time you've written episode 3, episode 1 is probably in the shops. You can't go back and change things. So you have to learn to kind of get it right first time. And if you have made some sort of slip up, be kind of become adept at being able to talk your way out of it or think your way out of it. Um, this is what, yeah, so even with the Long London quintet, it's a thing where I'm taking a long time to write these, but I think that I'm getting them right.
Mm.
Um, I don't think that the Great When needed an awful lot of edits. Uh, in fact, the only big edit was the fact that I'd included um, a thing at the back which I thought might be helpful for American or younger readers. Um, that just explaining some of the more obscure facts of the English narrative. I think specifically it was Jack Spot, his use of the word Yiddified,
Mm.
which was a real term that he, and probably only he, used. And it meant kind of anti Semitic, Hebrew phobic,
Mm.
terrified of Jews. Um, but I wanted to use that because when I was looking through my research on Jack Spot, that it was a little odd thing that sort of sprung out at me. But I didn't want anybody to think that I'd made it up out of
Mm.
some anti-Semitic, but for anti-Semitic reasons or something. So I thought, yeah, I ought to have a note for that, but I can't just have a note for that on its own. So perhaps I ought to do other notes as well for all of the other little bits. So there was a big section of notes at the end, which by the time I'd finished doing it, I thought, does this look? This looks condescending. Um, this doesn't really feel right. And so when Bloomsbury said we're not so sure about the notes at the end, and I said, right, well we'll get rid of them then. I'll work out a way that I can explain that term in the text, and the other ones weren't there for any particular reason anyway. So it felt a bit like that was my extra scene from Citizen Kane, like when Orson Welles had written a perfectly balanced and sort of judged extra scene where Charles Foster Kane visits a brothel. And so the producers came to him and said, "Yeah, this is a great, terrific film, Orson. This is a terrific script. Look, I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to lose the brothel scene." And he said, "Oh no, but that was my favourite. Oh." But then eventually he let them sort of take that out and wrote the film that he'd wanted to write. So
Mm.
it felt a bit like that, but not as intentional. But otherwise, it was pretty much. Uh, there are some small changes, sort of bits where I've reconsidered a phrase or things like that. But other than that, it's very close to the first draft. You know,
It does. It works again as a spell because I was walking down Berwick Street the other day, and Berwick Street is not the same as it was
no,
before I read the book. And I wanted to quickly just bring up as well. There was an interesting and effusive review in one of the weekend papers, which I thought had an interesting. It suggested that your work Unearthing, which began as an audio work, really, which incredible audio work, about your friend Steve Moore, who of course you also co-wrote the Bumper Book of Magic with, and I wondered, how much you do feel that kind of is psychogeography an okay thing to say? What's your
I
term for
think
this?
so. I think so. We know what
Right.
we mean, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah. So how much, Steve, you can still feel that influence, for instance, in The Great When, and how much the
Well,
Unearthing was a seed towards it?
I mean, like I was asked to do a couple of extra short essays for inclusion in special editions of The Great When, and one of them was called London Peculiar, where I'm talking about my relationship with London as a fantasy landscape. And I'm saying that all of this came from my association with Steve Moore and going down there and visiting his kind of family eyrie at the top of Shooters Hill, um, in the little kind of the closes and the crescents around there, um, and slowly picking up the various facts about the place. The fact that yeah, this row of nice houses, every second or third house is in a completely different style. Why is that? Well, that was because in the early 40s, British intelligence was leaking false information to the Germans, saying that haha, these German V rockets, they're putting too much fuel in them and they're overshooting London and landing harmlessly in the fields further north. So the Germans started cutting the fuel in the V bombs, which meant that instead of hitting central London, they were hitting Shooters Hill, which was the highest point of ground between London and Berlin. Um, and, started finding out, yeah, this is where Caesar came over the top of the hill. This would have been his first view of London, coming up the old Dover Road, which was Watling Street. That sort of, yeah, this is where they had the Armada beacon just across the road. Um, just you started to soak up, and of course I was already soaking up Northampton by myself, and that was my entry into London through Steve. And it was also my entry into writing was probably through Steve, and certainly my entry into magic.
Mm.
He has probably done more to mess up my life than any other single individual. Um, but yeah, I mean, like his presence is still a really big, and particularly with the bumper book.
Mm.
The fact that this was the only major project that we both worked upon together, and we had some pretty high hopes for it. And uh, yeah, and I was I shall always miss Steve's his brilliant conversation and company, but his incredible mind, his incredible scholarship. I mean, some of those things in the bumper book, um, they're brilliant. The our one-page treatise upon Dr. Faust, um, that we have solved things that even like Francis Yates was unable to figure out, the great Renaissance scholar. You know, we worked out that yes, there were two people. The first Faust to be named was this horrible diabolist and paedophile who'd just been thrown out of a boys' school for sexual offences. And he was Georgius Sibellicus Faustus Secundus, and he's the first mentioned Faust. Um, but he got confused with Johannes Faust, who was a divinity student at Heidelberg and was called the god of Heidelberg because he was so proficient at it. He was a doctor of divinity. The two men got confused when I think a canon or something was travelling in that neck of the woods and wrote a letter home saying, I was in this bar the other night and Faust, the so called god of Heidelberg, came in and was the foulest person that you can imagine. He was talking about conjuring demons and all sorts of sexual perversions. And so, yeah, he was the person who first confused the two and made Faust a doctor. And so we got that sorted out. And then when we were just getting to the end of it, I said, hang on, so Georgius Sibellicus Faustus Secundus was the first Faust. I said, so doesn't Secundus mean the second? And Steve said, oh, yeah, it does. So we looked for an earlier Faust. And finally, Steve said, I'm going to look in my Latin dictionary and found out that the word Faustus means a lucky man, which I suppose could be kind of code for a magician. He's a lucky man. He gets everything goes his way. He's got all of this wealth and stuff like so. Faustus, a lucky man, a bit like say Prospero, which has also got the same kind of connotations. So we thought, okay, so the first Faust was a kind of folkloric Faust in phraseology. Like we might say he's a bit of a Merlin, despite the fact that Merlin never existed, you know. So we got that sorted out. And then finally, when we were just putting it to bed, I said, hang on, we've done this one before. And Steve said, no, we haven't. This is the right page. It's Faustus. And I said, no, no, but we've done this story before. I said, this is the same story as Simon Magus. Um, and it's got Helen of Troy. It's got someone being carried through the air by demons. I said, this is the Simon Magus story, which was also a conflation of two different individuals and was an early Christian black propaganda story aimed at the Gnostics, who were Christianity's biggest rivals. Just as the Faust story, that happened in the early days of Christianity itself, but the Faust story happened in the early days of Lutheran Protestantism. And so, again, it's a propaganda story aimed at the Catholics. So, yes, I was quite proud of that. You know, I think that me and Steve did a good job on that one, and all in a single comics page, you know.
Brilliant. That's what I love about that kind of the density that you can do with those things. We better take some audience questions. We've not even talked about how you came up with Dennis Knuckleyard in a hazy, synaptic, explosive dream, wasn't it?
It was. I woke up at 2 in the morning. I'd just been drifting off to sleep, and I was in that kind of stream of hypnagogic rubbish that you are always swimming in before you lose consciousness entirely. And a phrase went through my head just saying, and then Dennis Knuckleyard. And I sat up in bed laughing. because I'd just never heard such a stupid name in all my life. Um, and I know that I won't have offended anybody out there whose name does happen to be Dennis Knuckleyard, because we checked, and as far as we can see, there has never been anyone or anything in the whole history of the world named Knuckleyard. So, sort of, yeah, I was quite pleased with that one.
The best one I think, there's a Mills and Boon about a French explorer called Where the Wolf Leads, and his name is Dracon Le Loup Blanc. And yeah, apparently I've looked up, there aren't any Le Loup Blancs
Le
either.
Luc Blanc, no, no.
Stephen would like to know, do you feel there are any artists in literature, film, etc., who are treading new, unpasteurised ground for you?
Yes, there are. I mean, like, um, there certainly are. I mean, like, in literature, I've recently become, uh, I was very, very interested when I read a book by an Argentinian writer called Mariana Enriquez, called Our Share of the Dark,
Yeah.
uh, which was a book about, it's an incredible supernatural horror story, um, but it's actually about the disappeared
Mm.
of Argentina. And I thought, this is great, because I'd started to go off horror because the world is so horrible. I didn't really see why we needed to invent more and more visceral horrors to torment ourselves with. But this is somebody who is using horror as an implement to say things that you couldn't otherwise say. I mean, when you're talking about the situation in Argentina, the vocabulary of horror is exactly the right vocabulary. And after discovering her, I got in touch with um, uh, an English writer who lives in Glasgow, called Heather Parry, who had done a brilliant first novel called Orpheus Builds a Girl, which is really upsetting, um, and again is really pointed at something in the real world. In this case, it was talking about the repeal of Roe versus Wade, but it's a sort of an incredible visceral horror story. And when I wrote to Heather and said how much I'd enjoyed her book and that I'd enjoyed it, um, in the same way that I'd enjoyed Mariana Enriquez's book, turns out Heather was a huge Mariana Enriquez fan and also recommended a lot of other South American women writers who were in a similar territory. So there was Samantha Schweblin, who did a beautiful anthology called Mouthful of Birds. Um, there was Fernanda Trias, who did a thing called The Rooftop, which is really, really disturbing. And Ariana Harvitz, who, for my money, was the most extreme of the three writers that Heather recommended. So yeah, there are some fantastic people out there in every form of art. There are people doing wonderful things in cinema. There are people doing wonderful things in music. I just feel that, and we should support them. I just would be happier if there were more of them, and if there wasn't such a smothering cultural effect where we don't have countercultures anymore. Apparently, they're too much trouble. Even though I would argue it's a vital part of culture itself. It's the part of culture that criticises culture, without which I think culture will probably stagnate and is stagnating. You know.
I think is there. I mean, because we did, you know, of course, Northampton now has an arts lab, you know, and things like that. You know, I just sorry to interrupt you, but I was just thinking, everyone, listen, you know, that bit of getting together a community of people who just want to write or create art or whatever it
Yeah.
might be, and without thinking about what's the market, but why you want to create it. That
Well,
thing where you go,
this is my I mean, like the arts lab has that was how I learned to write. It was how I learned my approach to art. That was when I was a teenager. It was an anarchic thing. It had no leaders. It was just a bunch of people getting together and saying, right, let's do some art. What shall we do? Well, a performance would be a good idea. Or what about a magazine? And other things will suggest themselves. But when I sort of when I reconstructed the Arts Lab in 2016, uh, the new Northampton Arts Lab, it's even better than its forerunner. And yeah, I'd advise everybody, it doesn't take anything. You just need a place to meet, which can be a pub back room. It can even be somebody's living room. And you just get together with a few like-minded people and you do something. And you're all learning from each other's experience. You're all being encouraged to experiment and think about things differently. It's great. Form an arts lab today, you know?
Yeah, let's make stuff.
Yeah.
One more question. I'm sorry, we have a lot of great questions. This person, Alan, oh no, I haven't actually got the name, but they want to know how much do you feel that your stories come from the internal, and how much do they come from the reaction to the outside world, outside literature, etc.
I don't even know if I could distinguish between those two. Um, for me, pretty much the the internal is the external. I tend to think of the world of sensory appearances that is out there. I mean, I am, as all of us are, I am creating that moment by moment in my mind. I do not have any direct experience. So, to some degree, it's all in my mind, even ordinary reality. Um, but I, and I suppose I absorb signals from everywhere. You know, sometimes it'll be from a book or a line in a book or a lyric in a song or a nice little sequence in a TV series or something like that. Or sometimes it'll be just something that somebody says in conversation, a phrase that somebody in the street will say while passing, um, or something that I'm woken up with from a dream. You know that all of these things they all go into a kind of cerebral stew, and when it's properly cooked and has reduced sufficiently, then it will come forth as some sort of writing. But yeah, I'm as influenced by the world as anybody is, but I try to transform that with my own internal processes into something new, into a new combination, a new synthesis.
Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Alan. The
Thank
great
you,
man.
Robin.
And it is, yeah, it is. It's what as I keep saying. It's that bit. Make the air thicker with exciting the connections that are everywhere. As I will now discover in Gould Library, and you will continue to discover sat in the front room in
We're in
Northampton.
Northampton. Absolutely. We'll see you soon, Robin. This has been great, mate.
And thanks
Goodbye.
very much for the questions, and thanks to Nicole who ran today's show for the How to
Yeah.
Academy. Bye bye.